Saints in cinema, all right? The missed opportunity of the early 20th century. This is a topic that spawned from a research paper I wrote many years ago. Let's begin. The church should teach Hollywood by example rather than by precept. An observation made by film critic Alva Johnson way back in 1931, the church and Hollywood, saints in cinema. What's the earliest history between these two cultural forces in America? During my research, I uncovered what I call the forgotten story of cinema's earliest seed. Although heavyweights like Louis Lumiere, Thomas Edison, William Dixon are generally credited with the creation of development, of operational stock cameras, it was actually a New Jersey clergyman who beat them all to the punch. His name is Reverend Hannibal Goodwin, 1877. This guy invents and patents the flexible celluloid film process that made motion pictures possible. His inspiration fueled by a simple desire to enhance Bible teachings. Flash forward to the mid-20s, it's evident, gang, the church had been utilizing the power of cinema for the gospel's sake with startling success. 1911, Photography magazine even reported films were a powerful way of uplifting humanity and becoming a new enemy of Satan. The amount of films produced and or exhibited by both Catholic and Protestant churches is staggering. At the height of the church movement, the local church became such a prominent site of exhibition that neighboring theater managers were complaining and arguing, churches, they're taking away our businesses. The film projector becoming a key piece of, I think you're one slide ahead there, James, becoming a key piece of necessary church equipment as a janitor, an organ, a pews of oak. The church was lifting up this early new medium at all levels of production and exhibition. In 1919, Variety magazine announced the Methodists had appropriated $300,000 to make a motion picture enterprise in the Holy Land, 10 films, $30,000 each. Movie missionaries were all the rage for Methodists, right? 1920 hits. Eastman Kodak gives 2,000 projectors to Presbyterian churches. Organizations like the Christian Herald magazine were primed to produce religious products. Literary Digest suggested the church was, quote, wrestling another weapon from the devil and converting it to its own purpose. And so it did. The church, friends, was on the move in the Roaring '20s. But then something terrible happened. While the church was busy building its staircase between heaven and earth with celluloid film, beginning in the early 1930s through the end of the 40s, the church made no outstanding pictures. History records several factors for us. Can you guess any of them? Well, I wanted to find out. I wanted to find out what caused this sudden change inside the church and what lessons can be learned from this odd twist in history. So one factor for the drop-off can be linked to, believe it or not, religious resistance inside the church. Another issue that was big was the inadequate finances during the Great Depression era, which makes sense. The third, though, stemmed from the second. That was the emergence of a new medium, radio. Ministers and evangelist organizations had found a new friend in the sonic world of the airwaves. It was cheaper. It was a more efficient medium through which to present a logocentric sermon of salvation that appealed more to the abstract mind than the image-based counterpart of film. Speaking of audio, films were now becoming what? Talkies, right? Which meant sound. So consequently, churches would have to incur additional exhibition expenses, wiring their sanctuaries, wiring their fellowship halls with speakers and early sound systems. Well, many pastors, friends, were simply not willing to do that. However, the church community knew very well the growing power of cinema, both for good and for evil. So what did the church primarily do? Well, my research for the answer led to something called the Code. What's the Code? It's the father of a system where we get today's PG-13, and R-rated film ratings. But under the hood of what at first appeared to be the church taking a moral stand against the growing sensualities of American culture may have been a tragic mistake. I submit to you, friends, that after benching itself to the cinematic sidelines, the church seemed to choose critique and censorship over creativity and screenplays. And it did it with the fervor of 1,000 Pharisees. It all began with something called, like we said, the code, or more commonly, the production code, okay? This is a set of moral guidelines that applied to U.S. pictures. It was more well known as the Hays Code, after Will Hays, who was the president of the Motion Pictures Producers and Distributors Association from 22 to 45. Now, in 34, there was an amendment to the code. It established the PCA, the Production Code Administration. It required all U.S. films now to receive a certificate of approval before being released into theaters. The PCA was run by a staunch Catholic named Joe Breen. More about him in just a minute. But the presence of the PCA raised the key thesis statement for that paper I was working on. Here it is. Did the church's decision to place its energies and trust behind the Production Code Administration divert its attention from producing more biblically based and Christian-themed films for mainstream consumption from 34 to 52? It's a tragic theory potentially, and perhaps a black mark on us, the church, that requires careful investigation. I say this because we may have an opportunity here for today's Christian filmmakers, today's independent filmmakers, to learn from history and therefore not repeat it. Back to Joe Breen now, how he ran the PCA for those 18 years from 1934 to 1952. Funding Breen's PCA bureaucracy was a scale, right, of sliding fees that increase each year. In general, the price for code certification ranged from $84 to $3,000. Bigger the film budget, well, the bigger the PCA fee. Breen's office annually vetted approximately 3,500 examples of potential story material from books, plays, short stories, magazines submitted by the MPAA. So it can be surmised the PCA took in easily each year millions and millions of dollars. Other sources of revenue included the option of posing a fine, a $25,000 fine on any studio that made changes to the film, like in editing, after it received the certificate and chose to exhibit the film anyway in one of its theaters. Now here's a summary quickly of what the list of don'ts were by the PCA. I won't read them all to you, but take a look at those list of don'ts. You couldn't do any of these things or you would be stamped with a rejection. Some are pretty obvious, some are crazy, and look at ridicule of the clergy. You couldn't do that. Some are pretty obvious about the sexual issues, but move on to another two-slide summary. This was called the be carefuls. There's 2 slides here. It's quite a long list. Let's see, you could not have sympathy for criminals, attitude for public characters and institutions, firearms, arson, and so forth. Another list is as interesting. Use of drugs, surgical operations, first night scenes, the branding of people and animals. Can't do that in films. Interesting. So you got these list of don'ts and be carefuls. They seem fair enough, but others on the list seem quite pharisaical. Now, it appears the PCA never received direct monies from any Catholic or Protestant churches, but the Catholic Church did form an organization called the League of Decency. It was a campaign led by the church to encourage its adherents to not attend immoral films. League of Decency worked in tandem with the PCA office and Joe Breen in censoring films to such a degree that author Greg Black said, the PCA and the League are linked so closely, it's next to impossible to separate them. In fact, one flashy, well-known director was actually charged with attempting to curry the League's favor. Remember him, Howard Hughes, Aviator, Leonardo DiCaprio, right? He was accused of offering to bribe the League of $150,000 if his film, The Outlaw, was given a stamp of approval and then released for exhibition. It wasn't. The League said no. All these restrictions in narrative storytelling begs the question, does the Bible have the same code of prohibitions in its stories? Scripture is full of accounts of both saints and sinners doing very bad things. Vicious murder, illicit sex, crime, rape, rage, deception, violence, so forth. But those stories, friends, aren't placed there to scintillate the senses, except perhaps Song of Solomon, or encourage more of the same bad behavior, but rather sin is shown in the Bible often to show men how sinful sin can be. Author Paul Elliott poked fun at what he labeled absurd censorship rules from PCA. In his book, With a Haze 99, he said, quote, if we accept the theory of divine inspiration, it becomes evident that the author did not share the ideas of censorship now prevalent throughout the world and virulent in Hollywood. Unpleasant, even the most shocking realities were not glossed over by him. He did not soft pedal the sex life of biblical heroes or dilute war stories to spare the nerves of anxious mothers. He took it for granted the human race could face the facts. Now, this view of God's authorship over his revealed word may be troubling to some of us, but we can't deny the fact that some pretty salty stuff is in our Bible. Yet the PCA and Breen, they bristled at the idea of allowing filmmakers to, in the 30s and 40s, to even remotely recreate some of these accounts. And so what? Examine their themes. It can be argued, in fact, that the PCA's grip over Hollywood, ironically, prevented Cecil B. DeMille from greenlighting the Ten Commandments' much anticipated remake until morality restrictions were relaxed in the 50s. It's simply doubtful DeMille seriously considered the more risque remake of his 23 version during the height of PCA's power. He simply waited until the PCA's power was all but gone. Evidence for this is charged can be gleaned from the Time magazine review of the film. Quote, what DeMille has really done is to throw sex and sand into the moviegoer's eyes for almost twice as long as anyone else has even dared to do. Now, there may be a lesson learned here about the danger of living by the law. Obviously, friends, the rule of order, legal system, these are necessary, have their place in our society. But when laws are inappropriately placed, they can have a very dangerous edge on our spiritual health. Romans 7:10 tells me this: I found that the very commandment or law that was intended to bring life actually brought death. This verse hints at a simple but powerful axiom on human behavior: rebellious curiosity. Could it be the censorship of immoral films by the PCA and the League of Decency only served to increase the desire to view them among the standard American populace from 1934 to 1952? Could it be this culture of censorship stunted the presence of quality religious films well beyond those tough years of the Great Depression era and when the lower cost happened for making sound into films? Well, in a 2010 survey by filmsnobbery.com, I found an interesting set of facts. This independent film source listed 50 of the most important religious films of all time. It may come as no surprise to us that only 5 of these films from 1934 to 52 made the list. Let's look also at the documentation of biblical epic films produced from 1915 to 71, a wider range. Let's go back and go forward, 1915 to 71, okay? In his book, Explorations in Theology and Film, William Telford divides these epics into 3 categories: the Old Testament epic, the Roman Christian epic, and then the Christ epic. According to Telford, 8 Old Testament epic films were produced. Only 2 were released during Breen's PCA reign, Samson, Delilah, and the other one. 10 Roman Christian epic films were produced. Only 2 films, again, released during his reign. Wow. Telford lists just 3 Christ epics produced from 15 to 71. These were King of Kings, Golgotha, and King of Kings again in 61, which was a remake of the DeMille version. Only Golgotha in 35 was produced and released during that Breen's reign. Note, before 1927, the character, Jesus Christ, had been featured to some degree in at least 39 other films. So I began to see, friends, that while some church leaders sought to engage the altering landscape of cinema and implement emerging technologies, the church as a whole across America chose not to invest sufficiently in the evolving media culture in which it was embedded. Author Terry Lindahl writes a very disturbing commentary about this problem in his book, Sanctuary Cinema. Quote, this was one of the most salient causes for film's ultimate failure, to establish a religious foothold. While pressing its cause in exhibition, the church's persistent hesitation to invest financially in film production and distribution kept it on the periphery of success. Now, ironically, part of this hesitation was the religious bickering between, the Catholic and Protestant church. The issue was around that one man, our friend Joe Breen. Viewed as an egomaniac by many, both inside and outside the code office, Breen would occasionally spit out self-incriminating evidence for this charge. One time he said, there are 2 codes, one written and the other mine. And I don't interpret the code, I make it. Whew. This means there was simply no shared consensus from an economical board on major decisions about the content of a film. Short skirts we can all agree on, right? But what about a movie idea about the intellectual and theological protest of, say, Martin Luther against the Catholic Church? Very unlikely. The Protestant Digest voices concern in 40 publication, quote, "The minority control of the most vital amusement source of the nation is one of the most astounding things in the history of the U.S." Several other critics agreed. Film critic Otis Ferguson of the New Republic said, "Breen is the one-man censor of the movies," adding that the Catholic machinery has stampeded the Protestants and captured the movies. This infighting between Catholic and Protestant sides of the aisle raises the question, why would the Protestant church even bother to attempt to produce films with a definitively Protestant slant, since it knew the Catholic-run PCA, League of Decency, would just yield its power to mute such a doctrinal voice? Protestants felt handcuffed for many years. There was little chance for these filmmakers to express their lens through cinema's art for mainstream audiences during the reign of the Catholic-dominated PCA. On at least one occasion, Hollywood made an olive branch to Protestants through the film called One Foot in Heaven about the life of a Protestant minister. But upon the release of the film in 41, we have two things happening. The Christian Herald editor Daniel Poling calls it a milestone in the history of motion picture. Yet he was appalled to learn a leading Catholic bishop with League of Decency had warned his flock to avoid the film because its subject featured a Protestant minister of the gospel. We move past 46 and beyond. We see the Protestant church clawing, scratching its way back to relevance on the silver screen. Dr. James Frederick, Episcopal priest, was determined to produce quality Bible-based films. Yet his frustration was mixed with urgency. Quote, "I've seen the pictures that have been produced in the name of religion, and they were most discouraging. I felt that unless we could get the quality of a theatrical film into a religious film, it would be futile to try and present religion on the screen, as it would only reflect to the detriment of the church." Friedrich went on to produce quality Bible parable films such as The Life of Paul and The Living Christ. Reverend Erwin Moon made several films revealing God's mysteries of his creation through the lens of science, right? After his initial film, The God of Creation, he produced 18 more sermons from science through 1971. In fact, the U.S. military even got on board and was using the films for their help as well. So we can note a different approach here. Less narrative storytelling, more straightforward Bible teaching and science-based evangelism from at least Protestant filmmakers. In the footsteps of these pioneers, we see a growing list of organizations and church denominations that drop the anchor into the sea of cinema. This thrust of cinematic works ranges from feature-length narratives to Bible teaching supplements. Today, Christian filmmakers, organizations, churches are engaging the cinema landscape with a fervor matched only by those roaring 20s. Linval summarized the new wave of biblically based and otherwise redemptive-themed films since the late 90s into our time today. He says, quote, "The Christian community is seeking to establish some kind of foothold, finding a predictable market and income. From end-time genre to family-friendly films to animated comedies to the widely acclaimed The Passion of the Christ in 2004, directed by Mel Gibson, a Catholic who perhaps maybe is helping bridge the gap between us and heal an old wound between Catholic and Protestant sides. It's very encouraging to me to see that Christians are now taking dead aim at recapturing the attention of mainstream audiences. Many Christian universities have even started film programs or have classes in their communication arts department, including right here at SAGU. Shameless plug, I know, sorry. More research is encouraged on the topic, but it's been shown in fair measure that from 1934 to 1952, an unfortunate phenomenon happened. The church's primary focus in the arts was spent on either funding other media expressions besides cinema or supporting the code against dangerous cinema, which both diverted attention and energies from producing its own good stuff, its own feature films for mainstream consumption. Today, though, Christians have embraced a more healthy and balanced approach, offering both critique and creativity. Several watchdog organizations are out there to assist parents in making choice for their children, focus on the family, Ted Bear's Movie Guide. And as we have witnessed in the last 15 years or so, dozens of faith-based filmmakers are utilizing both the cheaper point of entry to make films and then the independent model to get them out. It's an exciting time to be both a believer in Christ and a believer in the power of cinema. Now, I began our session with a quote by film critic Alva Johnston. And I close with another quote from her, from this Pulitzer Prize-winning author. She said, after laying down a clarion call to the church 80 years ago, she says this: let some religious group produce a pious epic that grosses $1 million. Back then, that was a lot of money. And there'll be an immediate stampede to dramatize purity and sanctity. It appears the church today may have finally taken her counsel. Thank you.